The sins of our fathers always comes back to haunt us. What price does Dike has to pay to save his life and that of his pregnant wife? Stay tuned while we uncover the secrets of the Umueze. The story of Dike and Kemi began on one sunny evening. On that evening, Kemi and Dike sat at the balcony of the apartment. Dike sat in silence, trying to escape the heavy weight of Kemi's words. "Why don't we ever talk about your village?" Kemi asked. "There is nothing to talk about, Kemi. My parents left Umueze for a reason, and they made sure I never went back. It's not a home, it's a graveyard." "But don't you wonder about your roof? That's your family house, sitting there, untouched. We should visit." Dike shook his head, his tone sharper than he intended. "You don't understand. That house isn't just a building, it's cursed. My father told me that much. It's not a place for us." Weeks passed, but Kemi's curiosity grew. The more Dike refused to speak about Umueze, the more she wanted to visit. She began to imagine the house, its walls heavy with secrets. One evening, Kemi went to Dike again, and she said, "You own it to yourself, Dike. I'll go alone if I have to, but I think you should come with me." Dike finally agreed. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. That place isn't just a house, it's a life, Kemi." The journey to Umueze began one early foggy morning. Their car rumbled over dusty roads. As they approached Umueze, the air seemed heavier. The vibrant energy of the city was replaced immediately. Umueze itself was quiet, the street lined with mud bricks houses. The villagers stared as the car passed. Their eyes was dark and unreadable. "Why are they staring?" Kemi whispered. Dike didn't answer immediately. His hands tightened on the wheel. "They know who I am. The Onyeka name carries weight here," he muttered, his voice filled with tension. At the edge of the village, the house came into view. It was exactly how Dike explained it to be, a graveyard. "This is it," Kemi whispered, stepping out of the car. The air around the house was cold, unnaturally so, and the silence was deafening. Dike hesitated at the gate. It felt like stepping into a memory he had never lived, one filled with dread. "We shouldn't be here," he murmured. Inside the house was filled of dusty surfaces, cobwebs hung like curtains, and faded portraits lined on the wall. Kemi stopped before one of the paintings. "Is that your grandfather?" she asked, brushing dirt off the glass. The man's tamed expression and sharp features bore a striking resemblance to Dike. Dike nodded stiffly. "Maybe. I never knew them. My father didn't talk about this place much." His voice was distant. That night, the house revealed its first secrets. As Kemi lay awake, the silence was broken by faint creaks, like footsteps moving through the hallway outside their bedroom. She woke Dike up. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He sat down. "It's just the house settling," he murmured. But when the room door cracked open, they both froze. The hallway beyond was empty, yet the sound of footsteps continued, growing fainter as if retreating into the depth of the house. Kemi shivered. "This place isn't right, Dike. Something is definitely wrong." The next day, an old woman appeared at the gate. Her hunched form and piercing eyes made Kemi unease. She seemed more shadow than flesh, her presence unsettling. "You shouldn't have come back," she told Dike, her voice sharp as a broken glass. "This house remembers. It has been waiting for you." "What are you talking about?" Kemi demanded, stepping forward. The old woman's gaze shifted to her briefly, but she focused on Dike. "You should go back immediately, Dike. Take your wife and leave this house. In fact, the entire village." Dike asked, "How do you know my name?" The old woman smiled, and she said, "I worked for your father before." Dike paled, hearing the words, hitting him like blow. "What happens if I refuse to leave?" he asked, his voice trembling. The old woman gave a deadly smile. "You cannot escape. The spirit will claim what is hers, one way or another." With that, she vanished, leaving only chilling silence in her wake. That night, the spirit came. Her figure was pale and translucent, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You have returned," she said to Dike. Her voice was cold and hollow. Dike sat up, his heart racing. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely over a whisper. The spirit smiled. "I am the debt your family owns," she said, "and it is time to pay. Come." The ghost led Dike to the dining hall, where a long decaying table awaited. Plates of spoiled food sat untouched, and shadowy figures began to appear around the room. "You must dine with Jed," the spirit commanded, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Dike's leg buckled as he was pushed into a chair. A glass appeared before Dike, filled with thick black liquid that bubbled. "Drink," the spirit ordered. Kemi woke up, searching for her husband, calling out for him. Kemi looked for Dike around the house for a while, then found Dike with the spirits and was shocked. She tried going to Dike, but a strange force held her back. Kemi stood by the doorway, tears streaming down her eyes. "Dike, don't drink that," she pleaded, but the spirit gaze silenced her immediately. "Drink," the spirit repeated. Dike raised the glass to his lips, the foul scent making him gag. The liquid burned his throat as he swallowed.
And the vision he saw overwhelmed him. He saw his parents' face aligned with greed as they held a woman hostage.
The spirit laughed. "You have survived the first trial," she said, as the room returned to silence. "But the true test is yet to come, Dike." With that final word, the spirit disappeared into thin air. Dike's body felt heavy, his vision blurred, as he stumbled back into the room after the spirit declared the first trial completed. His mind was trying to calculate the images he saw of his parents in the vision. Kemi rushed to him, her hands trembling as she held his face. "Dike, you are burning," she whispered, her voice breaking. He shook his head. "No, Kemi, it's not just my body. She is crawling into my soul, and this is just the beginning." The house was restless the next day. The walls were shaking, as if an invisible weight was on it, and a faint hum filled the air, like low murmur of a distant crowd. Kemi watched the house with fears in her eyes, but every time she turned to a corner, she felt as if someone or something was watching her. She found Dike in the living room, staring at the faded portrait of his father. The man's stem expression seemed alive, as though judging Dike from beyond the grave. Why didn't he fight this? Dike muttered bitterly. Why didn't he prepare me for this nightmare? The second night approached. Dike and Kemi sat together in silence until at exactly midnight, the spirit appeared again. Her form was clearer now. Her face was commanding, her hollow eyes boring into Dike's. "It's time, Walter, for your second trial," she announced, her voice slicing through the silence. "Follow me." Kemi tried to rise, but the spirit turned to her, raising a bony hand. "He must go alone. Interfere, and the cost will consume both of you." The ghost led Dike down to the basement. The walls of the basement were lined with ancient caverns, each symbols unfamiliar and unsettling. In the center of the room was a shallow grave, surrounded by a glowing circle of swords. "What am I supposed to do here?" Dike asked, his voice trembling. The spirit smiled faintly. "You must lie in the grave," she said. "To understand the weight of your family's sin, you must feel the earth that should have cleaned you generations ago." Dike stared at the grave, his stomach twisting. With trembling hands, he stepped into the circle, the air growing colder with each step. Kemi stood at the top of the basement stairs, her heart pounding. "Dike, don't," she cried, but her voice was drawn out by the spirit's chants. As Dike laid in the grave, the earth shifted beneath him, pressing against his body like invisible hands. The air grew heavier, and he felt as though he was being swallowed whole. His chest tightened, and his vision blurred. The spirit's chanting grew louder, and Dike's mind was flooded with vision. He saw his parents standing in this same very basement, their faces alight with anger as they made the pots. "Give me my child," Dike's mother said, her voice dripping with malice. This terror started when Dike's mother and father couldn't bear children after 7 years of marriage. They met with a young orphan named Cynthia, a beautiful young woman who they came to an agreement for her to become a surrogate for them. During the pregnancy, there were some complications. The child was not forming properly, and it was said that the child would be born with some deformity on the child's leg. Dike's parents decided to leave the child with Cynthia with no payment or care. Months later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl who was as beautiful as the sun, and shockingly, the child had no deformity. And Cynthia was happy on seeing the child immediately she came out. One day, the Onyeka saw Cynthia with her child, and they were filled with jealousy and began to beg for the child. But Cynthia refused. Who wouldn't? Just one day, the Onyeka invited Cynthia to their mansion, telling her they wanted to celebrate the child's birth with her. Naive Cynthia went, not knowing that was going to be the end of her. When Cynthia got to the mansion, she was served like a queen. Mrs. Onyeka instructed her maid to carry the child upstairs. Cynthia didn't agree, but was convinced that the child would be taken care of properly. When they finished eating, Cynthia asked the maid to get the child for her so they can leave as it was about to rain. The maid didn't answer her, and the Onyeka was seated and watching quietly. Cynthia immediately went upstairs herself, and the both followed her. As she was about leaving, Mrs. and Mr. Oyeka held her back, dragging the child from her, but her mother was adamant about leaving her child. Cynthia fought bravely to drag her child back from the Oyekas. Successfully, Cynthia dragged her child and ran off. But before she could go further, she was caught yet again by Mr. Oyeka this time. And the dragging continued. Cynthia angrily slapped Mrs. Oyeka and pushed her, saying, "You're a woman like me, but you left me to die. You left me with no money. You left me with no food. And now the child is perfect and you're back for her?" Mr. Oyeka, trying to hold her back from getting to his wife, she bit his thumb off and he angrily pushed her. And her child fell off her hands, and the child died immediately. Cynthia cried. She cried bitterly. Then she cursed the Onyekas. She cursed them that every child of them that steps foot into the house, or that was born into that house, would die, would face the same fate as her daughter. Cynthia tried to go out of the mansion so she can tell the villagers about what just happened. And Mr. Oyeka stopped her and strangled her to death, and his wife watched. On that same day, the Onyekas drove out of the village and the house. Years after, Dike was born. Dike screamed with tears in his eyes as the vision shifted. She saw the aftermath of their action, the life they destroyed, the child lying dead in that same basement, and the mother lying close to her child on that same spot he was. "You cannot escape what you are," the wench said bitterly and filled with rage. Dike screamed as the earth seemed to crush him. Kemi pounded the invisible barrier at the edge of the third cycle. Her scream missing with the spirits chanting, "Dike, get up. Don't let her take you," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and the oppressive weight lifted. Dike lay motionless, his chest heavy as he struggled to breathe. The spirit loomed around over him, her face expressionless. "You have endured the second trial," she said coldly, "but the final test will demand far more." Kemi rushed to his side as the spirit vanished. She pulled him from the grave, her hands trembling as she wiped the dirt from his body. "Dike, this is too much. You have to stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. Dike shook his head. "If I stop now, the curse will claim us both. I have to finish this, Kemi, for us, for our child." The house grew more reckless as the third night approached. The walls began to bleed a thick, dark liquid, and the shadow danced along the ceilings. The movement unnatural and jerky. The whisper that filled the air were louder now. "Whatever happens tonight," taking Kemi's hand, "I need you to promise me something. If I fail, you have to leave this place. Don't let it take you too." Kemi's grip tightened on his hands. "I'm not leaving without you," she said, her voice trembling. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." At midnight, the spirit appeared for the final time. Her form was fuller, solid now. Her white hair and thorn clothes giving her the appearance of a vengeful goddess. "Come," she said, her voice commanding. "The final trial awaits." She led them to a room they had not explored before. The air was thick with dust and broken toys littering the floor. In the center of the room stood a cracked mirror. "This mirror reveals your greatest fear," the spirit said, her voice low. "Look into it and face the truth of what you stand to lose." Dike hesitated, his heart pounding. As he stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection blurred and shifted, and then the vision appeared, Kemi holding a lifeless child in her arms. "No," Dike whispered, stumbling back. The image shifted again, showing him alone in the house, aged and broken, his parents' laughter echoing in his ears. The spirit's voice cut through his fear like a blade. "This is your weakness," she said. "Your fear is the chain that binds you to this curse. Break it or lose them all." She extended a dagger to Dike. "Cut yourself and let your fear flow into the mirror. Only then will you be free." Kemi grabbed Dike's arm, her voice trembling. "Dike, no. There has to be another way." But Dike did what the winch asked him to. With trembling hands, he took the dagger and pressed it to his palm. The blade cut deep, and the blood dripped into the mirror surface. The vision within, growing darker and more chaotic. Gathering all his strength, Dike slammed his bloodied hand against the mirror, shouting, "Take it, take it, take it all." The glass shattered. "You have severed the chain of fear that bound you, but the curse must take something. Nothing is undone without sacrifice." Before Dike could respond, the room was filled with shadows flying around. Kemi screamed as one of the shadows came towards her, wrapping around her legs and pulling her towards void. She clung at the floor as she cried out, "Dike, help me." Dike laid forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her with all his strength. The shadow hissed and snapped like angry vipers. Their grip tightened around Kemi's leg. His strength was fading, the weight of the spirit's presence pressing down on him like a mountain. "You cannot save her without choosing," the spirit said, her voice echoing like thunder. She stepped forward, her form growing larger and darker. Her hair whipped around her like fire. "Decide, Dike. Will it be her, or will it be your bloodline? The curse demands one." Dike's heart was shattered. The image of his parents, the vision of Kemi holding his lifeless child, and the mocking voice of the dead filled his head like a storm. The shadow pulled harder, dragging Kemi closer to the edge of the void. "Don't let go, Dike," Kemi screamed, her eyes locked on his. "Don't let the house take me. You promised." Her words were cut short as one of the shadows wrapped around her truth. Dike's vision blurred as hot tears streamed down his face. "Take me instead," he said, turning to the spirit. "You want someone? Take me. Leave her and our child." The spirit paused. The shadow froze in mid-air. Their hissing voices silenced as the house seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, only the sound of Kemi's breathing filled the room. The spirit stepped closer to Dike. "You would offer yourself so easily?" she asked. Her voice soft. "Do you even understand what you're offering? A life of emptiness, a soul forever tethered to this house. You would exist only as a shadow of who you are." "I don't care," Dike shouted, his voice cracking. "If it means saving her life and our family, then take me. Take whatever you want." The spirit studied him for a long moment. Then slowly a smile came from her face. "Very well then," she said. The shadow released Kemi, dropping her to the floor. "Dike, no. Don't do this," she whispered, her voice weak. "Please, Dike, don't leave me." Dike knelt before her, holding her face in his bloodied hands. "I have to, Kemi. This ends with me. You are now our child. You will be free. You will have the life we dreamt of." Before Kemi could respond, the spirit raised her hands, and the shadow came forward, holding Dike. His body jerked as they coiled around him, pulling him towards the shattered mirror. Kemi screamed and tried to hold onto him, but the force of the shadow threw her back. She watched helplessly as Dike was dragged towards the mirror frame. The mirror pieces rose into the air, spinning around Dike. The spirit's laughter echoed through the room. "Your sacrifice is accepted, Umueze. The debt is paid." Dike disappeared into the void. The house trembled, the walls cracking as though the very foundation was collapsing. Kemi ran out of the house, holding her tummy so tightly. When she got out, she knelt down. She cried, calling out Dike's name. "You saved us, but you are gone." She stood up, holding the piece of the mirror that she came out with, shining bright. She could sworn that she saw Dike looking at her from the mirror. "Kemi," she stood, looking at the ruined house and said, "Dike, I would live for you. I would live for your sacrifice and for our child." Kemi went to the car and she drove out of Umueze. Months later, Kemi found herself in the city, but still feeling so much pain and loneliness. She kept dreaming of Dike every night. He always comes to her dream, telling her to live for them, telling her to be strong for them. Kemi often wakes up every night with tears in her eyes. The day came when Kemi gave birth to their son, a healthy boy with bright eyes. But when the midwife handed him to her, Kemi's breath caught in her own throat. The sight brought a mix of joy and sorrow to her heart. Tears streaming down her eyes. "You are his legacy," she whispered to the baby, "and I will make sure you grow up free from darkness he faced." As the year passed, Kemi rebuilt her life, dedicating herself to raising her child and Dike's son. With love and strength, she told him stories of Dike, who gave everything to protect them. The boy grew up with deep sense of pride in his father. One night, Kemi sat alone, holding the piece of mirror. She hadn't looked into it since the day she left Umueze, but now curiosity and longing overtook her. Slowly, she raised the piece of glass. For a moment, it reflected only her face. But then, the image shifted, and she saw Dike standing in a dark room. His form was faint. "I am still here," he said, his voice soft but steady, "and I'll always watch over you." The curse couldn't take everything from us. Tears streamed down Kemi's face. Her hands trembled. "I miss you, Dike," she whispered. "Every day I miss you." "You gave me the strength to face it," Dike said. "Now it's your turn to give him strength. Promise me, Kemi, don't let the past hold you back. Live, truly live." The image faded. The boy grew, and with him, so did Kemi's hope. On the boy's 10th birthday, Kemi decided it was time to tell him the full story of his father, of the curse and the house that had claimed him. She took the piece of mirror from the hiding place and showed it to him. "This is all that remained of the curse," she said, placing the piece in his hands. "Your father broke it to save us. He gave everything so that you could live without fear." The boy held the piece carefully. "Will I ever see him?" he asked, his voice small but filled with curiosity. Kemi smiled softly, her heart aching but proud. "He is in you," she said. "Every time you are strong, every time you love, he is there. And maybe one day when you are ready, you will find a way to speak with him. Until then, you carry him in your hearts." The house was gone, the curse was broken, but the legacy of Dike's sacrifice lived on, not as a shadow, but as a beacon of hope, carried forward by the family he saved. The end.